Hey everyone, and welcome to The Year Was, a podcast all about today. I'm your host, Michael Montalvo, and together we take the history train back in time once again to discover what makes today truly unique. For the next few minutes, we continue to gather random nuggets of trivia to make you sound smart, or just drop out little facts that make others stop and say,
"Hey, who invited you?"
Like, seriously, why are you here?
On this episode, we examine the events that occurred today, August 14th. So this episode came around because I wanted to get you guys back onto the show. And everyone will know Matt Vann, Tim Kreitz from a few of the episodes that we've done before, one of them being the Hubble.
Yes.
And then, of course, Tim Kreitz Adventures and then the Vann Cave. So I asked you guys here today, not because you are from a bygone era. But
I think that makes me feel better about this. Thank you.
Yep. No, it's whatever I can do. But it's because you're wise. And that brings me to our topic. Rush Hudson Limbaugh III, is an American talk show host and conservative political commentator, and was born January 12th, 1951.
Wow, I never knew his middle name was Hudson.
Yeah, I didn't know that either. I looked that up. So we're not talking about politics, though.
We need to segue into a different Rush. Is that what we're talking about? Okay.
I wanted that to be a bigger joke and get a bigger laugh.
It was hilarious.
Yeah,
I'm laughing on the inside.
It did not land at all. But the year was 1974, and on this day, Neil Peart played his first show as the drummer of Rush.
Wow. So I was 4 years old.
Yep.
Now, what I also found out, and something that was significant to the history of the band, was that Rush formed in August of 1968.
Right. So they originally had a different drummer.
Mm-hmm.
His name was John Rutsey.
Yep.
And Rutsey was a good drummer by all accounts. If you have the first or have listened to any of the songs from the first Rush album, he is the drummer on that album. He was a good drummer. He was a very solid, sort of straightforward drummer. He wasn't a technical wizard of a drummer by any means. But he ended up quitting the band around I think it was either late 73 or early 74.
I think what I found, it was March 74.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. He did not really like the music that Rush was playing.
Well, yeah, and it was also what they said was that he had diabetes, and just the illness caused him to kind of step away from the band.
He struggled with diabetes his whole life, and in fact, that is what got him. He had a heart episode that was complicated by his diabetes. He had, and he died in, I believe it was either 2008 or 2009. I can't remember.
2002.
Oh, 2002.
Yep.
That's right, 2002. Okay.
Now, you mentioned John Rutsey. The original lineup also had Jeff Jones on bass.
Yeah.
And he left, I guess, pretty early on. And from what I found, and this is just off of Wikipedia, so, grain of salt, it was he wanted to go to a party, and that's why they got rid of him.
That's the most musician thing to ever.
If you had any idea, Mike, how typical something like that actually is in the musician world.
Yeah.
So
musicians are flakes. You should know that by now. You hang around with us.
Yeah, I mean, I get that. I get that. I understand that. He was replaced by Geddy Lee in September of '68, and that was right before their second performance.
Okay.
So he actually, Geddy Lee came on pretty early, too.
Right. I actually think that obviously Geddy's presence was pivotal to the band becoming discovered and having a major release and that sort of thing. My personal opinion on John Rutsey is that while he was a fine drummer and they had some great songs on that album, Working Man and others, Rush never would have been the breakout worldwide phenomenon that they became without Neil Peart. That's my opinion. They would have been, I always envisioned them, if Rutsey had stayed in the band without Peart's songwriting influence and poetry and just his phenomenal drumming and his vision, they would have been like a lot of other Canadian bands that did fine in Canada, but you never really heard of outside Canada.
Glass Tiger.
Well, maybe not Glass Tiger, but definitely like Frank Marino, Mahogany Rush, bands like that who are just the legends in Canada, but nobody knows who they are outside of Canada.
Yeah.
That's kind of how I always envisioned how the story would have gone for Rush had Peart not become part of the picture.
Okay. Well, I want to go into the history just a little bit, and just up until, they replaced Neil Peart as the drummer, or they got Neil Peart as the drummer.
Okay.
And it's, from what I was able to find out, they played around Toronto for a few years, and then in '73 they released their first single, which was a cover of a Buddy Holly song, and that was "Not Fade Away."
Mm-hmm.
After that, the record didn't perform well, this was all from the Rush website. It said that led them to the band's label, Moon Records. And then the first album, Rush, was released in March of '74, and then it was only a few months later that John Rutsey left.
Exactly. So Rutsey never toured.
Yeah.
In fact, one of the reasons they were in such a rush to get a drummer is because they had to start this tour to support the album. They were in a bind. And Neil Peart had been kind of dicking around in England, where he discovered Ayn Rand and some of the literature that would influence him lyrically for the next, few decades. But he went there to try to ply his craft as a drummer because he couldn't find his niche in Canada. He ended up being a jewelry salesman in England. Mm-hmm. Things did not go well for him there, and so he came back and was selling tractor supplies in Canada for like a family member's tractor supply business. And that's when...
Wow.
Yeah.
That could have been Neil Peart's legacy had he not hooked up with Rush. Geddy Lee liked him immediately. They hit it right off. And they discovered that intellectually they were hitting on all 8 cylinders together, and they felt like they could write songs together. Alex Lifeson, the guitar player, by all accounts, really didn't like him that much. And maybe that's too strong of language to use, but I guess I should put it this way. Neil didn't make a great first impression on Alex, and Alex wasn't really all that carried away with him. Neil was really into unorthodox drumming styles, even at that stage. At that stage, he had not really dug in heavily into jazz and swing at that point. He actually didn't start doing that until the late 80s or early 90s, but he still had a very unorthodox style. He was very much into Keith Moon, very much into John Bonham, whereas John Rutsey liked Bad Company. Mm-hmm. Like this the straightforward rock sound and stuff of the time.
I'm currently working on a book about unorthodox drummers frightening virtuoso guitar players.
It happens.
Whenever Tim's not here, we'll discuss it further.
Okay, yeah.
We have an unorthodox drummer.
Nice. Well, August 14th was when Neil Peart would have his first show with Rush, and that was in Pittsburgh.
Yep.
And then they released 2 albums the next year. And it wasn't until 1976 with, and I don't know if you say it 2112 or 2112. 2112. That was their big break. Yeah. And went platinum, and they started doing a lot more touring, and they ended up at the Macy Hall in Toronto.
So what they figured out with 2112, I think, is that if you do an album that's not a complete concept album, you have a better chance of blowing your album up and hitting a wider audience. So while 2112 was a concept album, it had standalone songs, and obviously the second half of the album is a giant musical suite, but the first side of the album could be broken up into individual songs with their own individual themes that stand alone apart from the story. Yep. They had not done that with the previous couple of albums, and so what they did from then on is that they kept the concept theme, they kept thematic aspects to their songwriting and their album crafting, but 2112 is where they got it. It's where the world started to understand Rush, and Rush started to understand how the musical world works a little better. That's what I think.
I'm okay.
Yeah.
I didn't really get on the Rush train until the late 80s, and even then I don't want to say it wasn't my thing. For whatever reason, what I was into and the things I was doing, it didn't hook me until I saw them live in 1989.
Okay. What tour was that you saw them live on? Do you remember what album?
No. I can tell you I was there to see Mr. Big.
Oh, Mr. Big opened for them.
Yeah, because Billy Sheehan on bass.
And that tells you a lot about where Matt was musically in the late 80s. Yeah.
Right.
Nothing wrong with that. Mr. Big was fantastic.
No, and they still are.
Yeah.
I I like Billy Sheehan's
Oh,
cat
yeah.
videos every day on Facebook. He's a great guy. He's an amazing. Billy is. I'm not going to go too far. It was one of the most unique bass players in the world. I have absolutely nothing to do with his style. I like him as a person and a musician, and I'll watch him. But I had to go see these guys live. I didn't know what they sounded like, and I went with a bunch of Rush fans, which is all dudes. You know, even Rush jokes about that.
Of course, yeah.
The average Rush guy was kind of a geek, D&D kind of dude,
Right.
stuff like that.
Read Tolkien.
Well,
read Brave New World.
We've
type
talked
of a dude,
about my friends, on the Civil Air Patrol, the dudes that I hung around with that were all into Civil Air Patrol and aviation. All those guys were huge into Rush. Every car I was in was playing Rush, and I didn't dislike it. I was just into another thing. Mm-hmm. Then I saw them live, and then when you see them live, and I was not really, I was just learning guitar. I was learning how to suck at 6-string guitar. But I was learning how things go. I was in a cheap seat, and I was looking down on top of them. Mm-hmm. And what I saw was amazing. Like, okay, I totally understand everything about these guys and what they were doing. And that is when I learned, and everybody says the same thing, when you're a musician, is to sound big. It's not about sounding loud or fast or anything. It's about how to sound huge in the dynamics.
Yeah. It's about figuring out a way to sound like there's more guys there than there actually are. It's about gigantic dynamics.
Yeah, and that's what they did. And the most amazing thing I saw all night, Neil Peart did his drum solo, and they had the big rotating, deal with all the kits. And again, I'm looking down on him. I have no idea what happened. He broke something, broke a drum. It was a snare drum. Mm. They flipped the kit around, how the kit would rotate. Mm-hmm. And they picked a guy up and held him horizontally and shoved him into the amongst all of the crap under there. And so he's, Neil Peart's butt is right here. And he's throwing out this solo, and this guy changes out a drum and hands it down. He's like he's in a rugby ruck, and they pass him another drum, and he puts it back on and tweaks on it a little bit, tuned it.
Yeah,
he had a key,
tuning key,
and then they pulled him back out and they flipped the kit back around. He started playing, and I'm going, okay, I've witnessed greatness.
Yeah.
So then I saw R40 in Houston with my wife, and I think she was probably the only girl there, but it was a great show. Yeah. And I'm kind of a mainstream Rush guy,
So I've seen Rush more than any other band I've ever seen live. Mm-hmm. The first time I saw Rush was in Odessa, Texas, in 1984 on the Grace Under Pressure tour. I had recently become a Rush fan. It may have been 85, but I think it was 84. Either way, it was the Grace Under Pressure tour. And they were fantastic. The place was maybe a third full. I could not believe how many people didn't show up to see Rush. But I had recently become a fan. My cousin, who lives down in the Rockport-Fulton area, had made me a copy of 2112. That's how I was introduced seriously to Rush, was 2112. So they came out the following year or later that summer or fall with I can't remember chronologically when it was. I may be totally making that shit up, but it's pretty close. They released Grace Under Pressure, and I was going to go see them. So I totally lied to my parents about what I was doing that night and who I was staying with, whatever. But a buddy of mine, his dad had a bunch of tickets. I don't know where he got them from, but my buddy was trying to find people to go to that concert, and I was determined. I was hell-bent. I didn't care the cost. I didn't care the repercussions. It didn't matter to me. I was going to be there, and I was there. And it was totally worth it. Changed my life. That concert is one of those things that I still remember the complete ambiance of it in my mind. It just changed things for me. So it was a big deal.
That's pretty cool. I've never seen them. I never had the chance to really see them, and I guess they stopped touring about 2016, I think, because of Neil Peart. His daughter died in a car accident, and then his wife died of cancer.
Right, and that had happened years before. Yeah. What happened with Neil was, and I totally respect this, is that he realized that between he had chronic tendinitis, he was having shoulder problems, he was into his 60s or pushing 60, and he realized, I can't physically do what I used to do anymore. I can't do it. And so I think a quote that I read from him this has been a while back, so I'll probably botch the quote, so let me paraphrase it. He basically said, I would have rather just given it all up and set it aside than keep trying to do it and end up like a song that I wrote. If you guys have ever heard Losing It, he didn't want to do that. He wanted to go out on top. He still wanted to go out when when people... And if you look at what some bands are doing right now from that era, from the 70s or 80s, you see how right Neil Peart is about that philosophy.
Well,
Motley Crue is a freaking travesty on stage right now.
But here's the thing. Here's the difference between all those is you get a band like Rush that it's one of those perfect storm bands. Everything about it is perfect. The songwriting, the tones, the way they're matched, and how they think and what they do, and it's only 3 people.
Yeah,
I mean, come on,
yeah.
That's the best part. And ZZ Top, same way, the same along the same lines. But then you have the backbone bands that they may have 8 members, but only 2 people do everything.
Right.
And as long as those 2 guys are still above ground, they can do anything they want. And Rush isn't one of those bands.
Right.
You got to have those 3. You got to have them in fighting shape all the time.
They are quite literally greater than the sum of their parts.
Yeah,
that's part of the
exactly.
magic of Rush. Yeah, absolutely.
Exactly.
I agree with that 100%.
So you guys kind of touched on it a little bit ago, just with them having some jazz elements into the music.
Mm-hmm.
They also did reggae and just radio-friendly rock, and I was wondering what your go-to Rush songs really are.
So mine span the gamut. I really like some of the stuff that Neil did after he got with Freddie Gruber, and that changed his style tremendously. In fact, where I really, really noticed that in his playing was during the R30 tour that I also saw them on. Britt and I went to that show in Houston, in Woodlands, and I remember thinking to myself, oh my gosh, man, he is really, since the last time I saw him, he's blossomed as a drummer. This was around 2003. And he was doing things like he was doing jazz sticking, like he was doing Buddy Rich style
traditional
snare stick and that sort of thing. And then he did this entire thing in the drum solo he had designed where he synchronizes his drum solo with a Buddy Rich track, and they're playing Buddy Rich on the screen and playing it through the PA, and he's synchronizing what he's doing to this clip of Buddy Rich, and it was the crescendo. And I remember thinking to myself, man, that's incredible. So I will say that my most influential, some of my most influential Rush songs early on are stuff like, man, this is hard because I love all of it. So, what do you pick that really, really influenced you the most? Hemispheres, that entire album was a very, very huge influence for me.
I actually have a note about that one because on the cover of Hemispheres, if I'm thinking of the right one, there's a man standing there, kind of reaching out, and it looks kind of like David Bowie. And then in the background, there's a man in a suit with a cane and a bowler. And if I'm thinking of the right thing, and again, I'm just kind of trying to pull this, Pink Floyd used that kind of same imagery with the man in the suit and the cane. And I'm wondering how common that really was, or if that was something that was in, I guess, rock music during that time.
That era, that was all huge. That
avant-garde artistic style. And back then you had an album. You actually had a vinyl album that needed a lot of artwork.
Yeah.
And so it was very commonplace to have avant-garde artwork to complement avant-garde music.
And you look at the time and how the music was chopped up back then, and how important your genre was. That was enormous. So, and if you liked Rush, you probably liked Pink Floyd, and so things kind of
I guess what I'm really trying to figure out if they're referencing each other on their album art, or if it's just kind of.
I doubt it.
I think that's just the style.
If you look back across that, look at albums like "Look at Yourself" by Uriah Heep, even going back 10 years before that. That sort of artwork that was very esoteric and very eccentric and had all these purportedly or perceivably deep concepts drawn in or painted in. It was not uncommon at all.
Well, and here's another way to look at that. During that time period, from the hard rock era, mid '70s on, when you look at the albums of most of what was on there, and you mentioned Motley Crue, and you take the hair metal phase and all that stuff, it was the people. It was how they dressed. It was the hair and the lipstick and all this crap.
Yeah.
Rush and Pink Floyd, nobody knows what those guys looked like most of the time. I mean, it wasn't that kind of look. They were just regular looking dudes. And so the focus was on the artwork. So when you see the Prism, that's Pink Floyd, the Pigs, and Rush, you see the Presto Rabbit and stuff like that.
Yeah.
So it was kind of on that cerebral thing.
And it was very much used to brand the concepts and brand the band and contribute to the band's image. It was hugely important. It became less important around 81, 82 because a couple of things happened. One was MTV happened. The other was the compact disc happened. So at the same time, you have two things that are pulling away from the importance of album art, because the format has gotten smaller, and at the same time, you're seeing the artists on television all the time for the first time ever. So the image and look of the artist becomes hugely important, and the artwork on the album becomes less important because now it's just 4.5 inches by 4.5 inches. And so marketing and concept, even concept within the band, with how the band's directed their creative product, that all changed partly as a result of that. There's no doubt about it.
Yep.
I don't remember if we talked about your go-to Rush.
YYZ.
YYZ?
Yeah. And I'm the more mainstream, picked it up on the radio. My wife likes that song, kind of Rush guy. And I don't even remember why or how, but started as another band I was in, Argument Over Time Signatures, and Raul Aguilar. And I got to messing around. I was in the Corey Yeager band because Corey Yeager hated Rush, and we picked a song of his, I can't remember which one. It's roughly the same tempo, and Raul and I would end it in YYZ.
Oh, okay.
So the band would stop, and the drummers and the bass player would play the end of YYZ. But when you get into YYZ, especially as a bass player, there are some complexities and techniques in there that if you want to know how good Geddy Lee is to watch that. And I'm not talking about the little solo-y parts and things like that, but just what it takes to play the rhythm lines. And well, there are 5-6 movements in that song that are all very unique, again, over a weird time signature with the changes. And I can't remember which Rush members said it, but they said we realized how good we were when we would change time signatures 3 times in the song and the audience would never catch it. And that's something they do. And that's the prog rock part of it that musicians, we kind of chomp at, like, bass and bright things. And so that's what did it for me. I was going to do YYZ on the upright for Mike's intro, and I can't remember how to play it.
You just do the tritone part at the beginning. Yeah. So the thing about YYZ is that it's probably, if you ask the guys from Rush, they'll tell you that it is, if not one of, then it's the most complex arrangement they ever did. They tried to do that live in the studio. When they went to the studio to record that album, they were determined, we're going to do this in one take, and then we'll do whatever overdubs we need to do to widen the sound. But they couldn't. Geddy Lee, I remember in one interview reading where he said we literally had to resign ourselves to defeat. We could not get YYZ studio perfect enough to play it live all the way through in the studio. So at the the record company's going, hey, you have to pay attention to things like studio time back then, and studio time doesn't matter now because you can record a great sounding album on a freaking laptop if you know how to do it. But back then, studio time was expensive and you had to get things done, and so they finally broke it down and did it in sections and edited it together. That's how complicated the song was, even for them. But I've heard them play it live over and over again, and
I was going to ask if they did it live.
Sounds fantastic.
Yeah, it's amazing. It's amazing live.
I want to go back just a little bit because they went on an indefinite hiatus, and that's when Neil Peart's daughter and his wife died.
Right.
And then after that, they came out with Vapor Trails in
Right.
2002,
Mm-hmm.
and that was the first time since the 70s that
Yeah.
they didn't use synthesizers.
Exactly. And that was very much to do with Alex Lifeson. So they recorded Test for Echo,
Mm-hmm.
and they went on the Test for Echo tour, and then Neil Peart's daughter got killed.
Yep.
She was killed in an auto accident, and her mother, who is Neil Peart's longtime, basically common law wife, who had been fighting with cancer, died. And if you've ever read Ghost Rider, his book Ghost Rider, he talks about how his wife, common law wife, literally gave up after their daughter died. And within something like, I don't know, 6 or 9 months or something like that, she died too.
I don't know if I have it on there. I think it was like 9 or 10 months.
Okay, yeah, but less than a year.
Yeah, less than a year.
Yeah. So Neil told Alex and Getty, I think it was actually at her funeral, consider me retired for the immediate future. And so they did. So he went, he bought a new BMW. He went and rode something like 75,000 miles or something.
Yeah, he disappeared on a motorcycle.
He disappeared on a motorcycle for a number of years. And some things happened in his life. I won't go into the minutiae of it, but he basically met another woman. He started to feel better about life. He started wanting to play drums again, and he told the guys, hey, I'm ready to do this again, and they recorded Vapor Trails. Now, my opinion of Vapor Trails is that it is a very, very strong album. Earthshine is one of the Rush songs I would put in probably my top 10 or 15 Rush songs. That song grabs me every single time I hear it. They made some mistakes with Vapor Trails, though, in that was right in the middle of the Loudness Wars, if you remember that. That's when they were mastering albums so mother effing loud that you basically had to compress. When you go into the mastering studio, the main thing you were doing is you were compressing the mix because it was so damn loud. And they took a lot of criticism for that, which they received. They knew once they heard the album, man, this thing was not mastered right. It was mastered. It's way too compressed. It's way too loud. It's clipped in some places if you really listen closely to it. And so that album didn't do terribly well, which sucks.
But the timing for it too.
But
just everything else that was going on at the time, that was just
musically it was a bit of an aberration compared to what else was on the radio. During that time, it was bands like Creed that were on the radio.
Yeah.
And I'm not saying anything good or bad about Creed. I'm just saying that, I'll say, if I'm honest, I'll say a lot bad about Creed. But
that was just a dead spot.
Exactly. Iron Maiden went through the same thing at that time in the early 2000s, releasing albums that they just couldn't get airplay, even though they were doing some of the best work of their career. Some of the most mature music that Iron Maiden produced was, from like 2001 to 2003, things like Brave New World and Dance with the Devil and those two things. Those albums got completely overlooked in America. I don't know about the rest of the world.
They're huge everywhere.
It was just a bad time. Yeah, it was a timing thing for sure with Vapor Trails. But I love Vapor Trails. And also, if you would like to hear it not too loud and not overly compressed and clipped, they went back in something like 2010 or 2012, maybe 2013, and they remixed it. And it's actually called Vapor Trails Remixed. They remixed it and remastered it, and it sounds way, way better.
Yeah.
So
it's outstanding.
So so it sucks that Vapor Trails kind of tanked for them when it was Neil was all fired up again. But it led to good things later on, and they got their momentum back eventually after that.
The last thing I kind of want to mention, I didn't know if you were about to say something. I felt like I was
well, he mentioned Neil Peart's book. I was going to mention Geddy Lee's book, but we can get to that anytime you want.
No, you want to go? Yeah, go right ahead.
Geddy Lee recently wrote a book. It's kind of a coffee table book about the history of the bass guitar as we know it. He got to a point where he just said, here's this instrument that's been around since essentially the 50s when they electrified the upright bass, made it more like a guitar, like a standard guitar, but we don't know a lot about the history and the development and what's gone on. And he wrote an incredible book about it, and he did a little book tour and all. It's really good. He scrounged up prototypes and originals, and it is a fantastic piece of work.
Yeah,
So,
I heard a radio interview with him when he was talking about his inspiration for that book, and he said, I'd been playing this instrument for 40 years and didn't really understand it. I had a collection, but my collection of basses was basses that I played in the studio and live. I collected for a utilitarian purpose.
Yeah.
I didn't collect for historical purposes. And he said one day somebody asked him or whatever, what was the first bass, or where did electric basses come from, or something like that. I can't remember the exact context of his comments, but basically he couldn't answer the question. Yeah. And he realized, I need to figure this out. This has made me a very successful musician over the years, this instrument.
He tied a lot of things together about bass history and a lot of the minutia of how the instrument came to be and how the tone came about, and for years it was just the Fender Precision bass, right. The black and white one up there, and variants of it, and why they changed it, and why they did this, and why they wound it this way, and why it was fretted this way, and why they used these woods. And most bass players were just like him. They asked him the story. If you guys pull up a picture, he's either holding a black and white Fender Jazz or Rickenbacker. Yep. And those are just the sounds that he likes. And when they ask the story, they want to hear something crazy about how he, had a vision, of spirits in heaven, and this guitar was handed. He's like, I saw it in a pawn shop and I bought it. Yeah, I needed one. This one got broken. Whatever. There's just not a big, compelling story to it, and he kind of puts all that in that book. It's fantastic.
Yeah. Well, a couple of things I want to go into real quick. I don't know why I got it in my head, but I kept thinking that Neil Peart was one-armed. But that's the drummer for
Def Leppard.
Yeah, right. And,
what's his name?
And any comparison between Rush and Def Leppard may be that may fall under the death penalty in some countries. Yeah. So be careful doing that.
Oh, no,
the interesting now, I will tell you of all of the three members of Rush, Neil is the kind of withdrawn, quiet,
right.
Guy.
That's true. In fact, after and the circumstances of his life have contributed to that.
Oh,
He never liked being interviewed and being sort of the center of attention to begin with, but after the tragedies in his life and they came back for Vapor Trails, that is when you'll notice that all of the press interviews, all of the radio, TV, magazine interviews, and publicity events, that's when he is no longer a part of it, because that was part of his agreement when he came back. He was like, hey guys, I want to come back. I want to start doing Rush again. I'm real fired up, but I don't want to be part of the public spotlight anymore. And they were like, cool, no problem. Just to come back. Just come back. We'll work it all out. And that's when you started to see Alex and Geddy. Before, it was Geddy and Neil. Everyone gravitated toward Geddy and Neil. For understandable reasons. I mean, Alex kind of had this reputation as being a little bit wheels off and being less intellectual, I guess you could say. And not that he's not a smart person, but he was not looked upon.
He's a little more rock star than the rest
he's a little bit more of just a greasy guitar player, than an intellectual. And so after that, you notice that Alex sort of polished himself up a little bit. He became more articulate.
Yep.
He paid attention to how he was representing the band. And so I think that in a sense it was kind of good for Alex in a way too, because he became more of an ambassador and a spokesman for the band in his own right.
Something else Geddy is known for in the bass world, that era, 70s to the 80s, where you would see the band with the giant walls of amplifiers in the back, Yeah. Well, here's the thing. After the late 70s arena bands, all the work is done by the PA system, by the main speakers that are driving the house. And you don't need these walls and walls of speakers, but they kept them just for the aesthetic. They would have a couple of amps that were spares in case one blows down. The roadie just goes out, tech goes out and changes them. So these guitar players, they actually sell bass and guitar amps. They're fake. They're just walls of speaker grills, right? And Geddy kind of, I guess kind of poking fun at it, his rig is all off stage, and his is very much like what I use, playing in, small venues with Tim or recording or whatever. It's this very small, tasty tone thing that's probably duplicated. It's triplicated just for redundancy. There's 3 of everything in it, placed to one speaker with a microphone, or actually it's all direct. But behind him, he has things like giant rotisserie chicken ovens.
Yeah. And washing machines.
And I saw the one with the ovens. And when he has the ovens out there, he has the people come out and they baste the chickens that are turning.
The two funniest things about that is that the rotisseries, during the concert, a dude comes out and bastes them a couple of times. Yep. And then this is the funny thing is that if you stick around long enough after, like on R30 is where I noticed this. The other thing that he had sitting beside the rotisseries was a giant washer and a giant dryer front mount. And after the show, a roadie comes out and opens them up and takes all the clothes out and puts them in giant laundry baskets and carries them off like the laundry
R40, I remember the washers, I think it was. But then on both sides, they have just piles and piles of speakers, all sizes, these giant things. And through the show, they get smaller and smaller until they're on little amps sitting in chairs,
like when they first started.
They first started. So
that's bad, which is awesome. That was a great way for them to go out. For sure,
that really was
very apropos.
Whenever I was doing research for all of this, like I said, I'd been listening to Rush for the last couple of days, and I've been watching videos just on YouTube. And one of the ones I came across was a South Park intro for it. I don't know if you guys have seen this.
Maybe.
Oh, yeah.
Where they have the kids of South Park. They're there, and they are performing Tom Sawyer.
Oh, yeah.
And then they have to go in, and whenever it's like, play the real song, the lights come up, and Rush is on the stage playing the song. So I thought that was cool.
So what's your go-to Rush piece now?
I'm just kind of all over the place right now with them. I'm absorbing everything, and I'm just like, oh, that's really good. That's my favorite one. It's like, no, that's another.
So here's my question for you. You've hung out with us, and you've listened to all of our douchebag music and all of our crappy opinions and why we think everything sucks.
Yeah.
How now binging on the kind of stuff that shaped our brains over all these years as fans and musicians, do you see it now?
I see more of it than than I really want to admit. So it's like, oh yeah, I understand it now. So
part of the magic of Rush for me is the fact that there are a few bands. There's this handful of bands whose music has literally become part of the tapestry of my life.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
And Rush is one of those bands, all going all the way back to when I was 14 years old and I discovered Rush in 1984, and I realized they had all these older albums. And then there were times in my life, I can tell you about when I got married and what Rush album I was listening to then. I was listening to Counterparts when my wife and I, right after we got married, and we had lived in this little apartment. We were saving money and building our careers, and it's one of those things where they just become such a part of my life. I can listen to a song and tell you where I was, and that I think that as a musician, I've had people on a few occasions tell me that about Tim Kreitz music and about some other national bands that I've been a part of over the years. That's as good as it gets as a musician. Mm-hmm. When your music transcends itself as media and becomes something spiritual, you can't ask for more than that. That's worth more than the money you would make off of it. That's the things in life that truly matter. We sometimes forget what life is all about. We get focused on the things we have to concentrate on. But when you can do something that touches another person's spirit, I'm pretty sure there's nothing better you can do on the planet. There's no higher accomplishment than somehow blessing the spirit of somebody else with your art or your science or your actions or whatever. So anyway, that's my deep moment.
He just pays me to play the bass lines. I don't give a shit.
Well,
I don't care.
Talking about Tim Kreitz band and everything, I can remember the first time I saw you guys live. And it was just kind of one of those moments where, and I told you guys this right afterwards, but I was sitting, I think it was at the bar the first time I saw you. And I was up there, a Facebook post that I randomly saw, and I was like, oh, I'll go check this out because I know these guys. And it was just kind of one of those moments where I was just sitting there, and I was like, okay, this is what I want to be doing right now. This is what I want to listen to. And whenever you guys were playing, and after you played it, you guys came down, and I was like, you just make it look so effortlessly cool. That this like, I want to do that, but it's like I can't do that. So.
Well, I certainly appreciate hearing.
First of all, you have to get rid of your life.
Yeah, that's the thing.
Here's the thing: when you see the guys on MTV or whatever the hell kids watch now, YouTube, and you see these guys and they're musicians with all the chicks and helicopters and money, throw all that shit out the window. You have to commit yourself to a life of staying home every weekend, sitting on the edge of your bed, jamming to Back then it was cassettes, playing it over and over and over to learn. Yeah.
Yeah, I had a cassette player when I was in high school that would play half speed.
Yeah. Oh,
so
those were cool.
So you could figure out licks easier because it would play it at half speed and obviously one octave lower, so you didn't have to retune your guitar. And that was my life for years and years and years. There were years where I literally locked myself in my bedroom and practiced.
YYZ is a perfect example of that. I'm listening to it, and there's so many intricacies that Geddy's doing, and I can get on YouTube. And there is Geddy Lee showing me how to play YYZ. Yeah. This is what I do.
Oh, yeah.
That was the moment. Talk about Rush being a defining moment. When I saw that, I just had to pause it and sit back a moment and go, this is just a revolutionary moment in my life because that was all such a mystery when you were a musician in the 70s and 80s. You just didn't have that. And here's Geddy Lee. Here's what I was going to do. And here's what I did, and here's what I typically do live, and it's out there.
And that's interesting because you do have to do things with a nuanced difference live than you did in the studio. You know? When we record something, I'm always mindful about I don't want to overproduce this. I don't want to have too many guitar tracks on it. I don't want to depend too much on another instrument. One of my favorite things to do in the studio is to lay down a Hammond B3 organ, just gluing everything down in the background because it sounds so thick and so good. And I probably do it too much, but it works for me, and I really like it. And but I never want to depend on anything like that because you want to be able to replicate what you've done in the studio live as closely as you can. But that requires sometimes slight changes to arrangements, slight changes to the parts, slight changes to the transitions in the arrangement, and that sort of thing. And Rush is masterful.
I was going to say that's Rush because you hear the things that they've written live. You hear the things that they've written, like we were talking about YYZ and how it was fragmented and all that. So, and even that's just the nature of the music. Right. When Satriani did his first album that was recorded live, it was a completely different animal. You just had to play it and sit back and go, okay, that was totally different. I gotta listen to this again because it was recorded. Everything was done right there live, and it's tough because that pushes everybody. So, yeah.
Cool. I think that's a good as spot as any to end this.
Right on.
At least for the recorded part. I'm sure we're going to be sitting around talking about this a little bit more.
I'm sure we will.
Yeah.
I hope we didn't ramble too much.
No.
As you can tell, I get really excited about Rush.
This is why I wanted you guys here, is just because I knew you were going to be able to talk about this.
You cannot get two musician egos in a room and ask about Rush and expect it to be 20 minutes.
Yeah. Let me go ahead and do this outro, and then we will go ahead and call it, I guess.
Right on.
That's going to do it for us today. If you're watching this on YouTube, you can find the audio version on iTunes, Podbean, Spotify, Google Play, anywhere you get your podcasts. And I lost my spot. And yeah, I'm leaving that in because if you want to hear more, I said that already, didn't I?
Nope.
Give us a rating and a review. That helps me out and all of that. Lets me know where to keep this going. And if you liked it, share it with a friend because they might like it too. And I'm going to pick up this paper so I can look at it without having to. This is going to be very bad for all the video people that won't see my face at all. There's my spot again. I lost it. You can find me on social media and YouTube at the Apple Cider Club. Matt is on the Vann Cave.
The Vann Cave.
And Tim is Tim Kreitz Adventures.
Correct.
And as always, I want to thank the Tim Kreitz Band, who we have most of here today, for our musical theme, and to thank you for listening. We'll see you next time. fine. Oh, wait,
Nailed
sound
it.
effect. There we go.
Masterfully done.
Yeah.
Dun, 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 dun.
Oh, yeah, that's good. It's all staying in.